Earlier this month, President Biden called on governors to pardon simple marijuana possession charges at the state level. Governor Greg Abbott rebuked the request, saying, quote, Texas is not in the habit of taking criminal justice advice from the leader of the Defund the Police party.
Since then, Abbott, along with Governors Bill Lee and Asa Hutchinson, have raked in more than $263,000 from donors linked to the private prison industry. According to reporting by The Lever, quote, since 2020, two private prison giants alone, CoreCivic and the GEO Group, have dumped more than $1.7 million into the Republican Governors Association, which bankrolls GOP gubernatorial campaigns across the country.
Joining us now to discuss is managing editor at The Lever, Joel Warner. Welcome, Joel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to see you. So tell us about this kind of private prison incentive, I guess, to have a more carceral policy.
The prisons themselves have admitted in their reports that the cannabis reforms, including the ones that the president announced a few weeks ago, are going to have an impact on their bottom lines. Literally, they will just, so many of their prison cells have been filled with the victims of the war on crime that now that we're seeing reform efforts, I think you have a lot of these large operators who are getting quite nervous.
That's a really good point to note. We know that the private prison industry has increased in size 14% since 2020. That was literally just 2 years ago. And in large part, that was due to them basically utilizing these private prisons to for immigration purposes.
Right. Yeah, I thought it was an immigration issue. Primarily, that's what the private prison system was taking care of at this point.
So what do you have to say about this seeming shift that they are now looking to? Because private prisons, like any private industry, is here to make money. So we acknowledge that criminal justice reform efforts in and of themselves, in many cases, made private prisons get a little bit shaky, and their relationship, very cozy relationship, with Republican governors.
We're going to see the prison industry continue to shape how the Republican governors are going to be responding to policies, whether it's immigration or whether it's cannabis reforms. I think at this point, when it comes specifically to cannabis reforms, it's not if this is going to happen, but how it's going to happen. So I think what we're going to see is these private prison industries really pushing how these reform laws are going to be passed, instead of focusing on more of the prison reforms, more of pardoning low-level kind of cannabis convictions, less of expunging former kind of cannabis records. It's going to be focused more on just legalization efforts and less on actually kind of reforming some of the harms of the war on drugs in the past.
Do Democrats receive, donations? Are they subjected to lobbying in places that are under? Obviously, there are some cities, states, et cetera, that are under Democratic control. Do those when the private prison industry might have a financial incentive? Are there donations? Is there lobbying there as well?
Well, of course. As we know, the private prison industry is so huge. They are going to be impacting kind of politicians of both kind of Democratic and Republican states. So you will see the same thing. You will see, especially as more blue states start to legalize their cannabis laws, one of the big issues is how much kind of prison reform there is going to be. And that really comes down to how much money is being funneled to the people in power, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans.
So since I'm libertarian, I'm not against privatizing things in general. So the private part of the private prisons is not what bothers me. It's the prison part. But I absolutely understand your point that I would just say that the laws need to change, because I think all of these things, I think marijuana and even more stronger drugs, I support legalizing all of them, and it should be done at the political level. It's something the government has to do. But I understand, where you're coming from, which is saying that this industry specifically has an incentive to lobby the government to have more unlibertarian or more unliberal, more anti-freedom policies in order to lock more people up. Is there? So while ideally I would say the law should just change so that these things are not illegal in the first place, are there other reforms like anti-lobbying measures that can be taken into consideration?
In general, or you mean for
this industry
cannabis laws in
specifically?
general? It's
No, for
interesting
the private
because
prison
I think
industry,
for the private industry, I think in general we haven't seen a lot of push around that. I think because this industry is so new, because these laws are so new, we're actually seeing a lot of kind of quid pro quo kind of across this entire kind of industry in legalization efforts. I mean, we have states that have been actively kind of collecting money from kind of big cannabis businesses in response to deciding where medical licenses and recreational licenses are going to be located in places like Massachusetts. So I think in general, most of the activists are just focusing on getting this stuff legalized and getting these reforms in place versus how much kind of money is going to the politicians who are shaping these laws. So I think we haven't seen much of that yet.
This is a tough thing, and I say that because, as somebody who's not a supporter of the private prison industry or a lot of private institution in general, the issue that I see with it is largely regulatory. There are a lot of issues that happen within the private prison industry, whether they're charging more for phone calls or they're not providing adequate medical care and things like that, that are not necessarily the same problems that you see at that height in your generalized state-run prisons. With that, looking at that, and also looking at a question that Robbie asked earlier that I was going to double down on, as someone who's worked in criminal justice reform and has worked with the Congressional Black Caucus Institute and the CBCF Foundation here in DC, one of the things I know about private prison industry is that they're not only appealing to conservatives. We talked about the Republican Governors Association earlier, but a little tidbit that few people know is that the criminal justice reform efforts that have been designed just this past year from the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation were designed with specific input from private prison industry leaders. So these are people who are supposed to be representing the Black community and Black community interests, which has largely been shaped by our failed criminal justice system, who are literally going to the people who have a vested interest in locking people up who look like me and asking them what they should be doing in their criminal justice reform efforts, and literally writing policy designed by what these leaders tell them. So I think this is bigger than, and it goes beyond what might happen with marijuana pardons, but also to the strength of the private prison industry to work both sides of the political aisle.
Yeah, and I think you have it exactly right. I mean, these are private companies, and they're looking for successful markets, right? And if they are going to be losing access to some of kind of the war on drug markets and the cannabis markets, they're going to look at other kind of captive markets, as you pointed out, whether it's other kind of minority groups, the immigration efforts. I mean, we're going to see them saying, okay, if we're going to be losing some of our quote unquote kind of market share from the war on drugs, like where else are we going to be able to expand? How are we going to be able to kind of offset that loss in prisoners and that loss in profits?
Well, Joel, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have more Rising right after this.